The fluorescent lights hummed with a constant, jagged buzz. Marcus gripped the edge of a heavy crate, his fingers raw from the coarse cardboard, and shoved it onto the conveyor belt. His first shift at the warehouse had stretched into 12 hours of repetitive motion. Scan, lift, stack, repeat. By the time he walked out into the parking lot, his back ached and his hands were coated in gray dust. He watched his coworkers gather near their new trucks, comparing prices and boasting about the latest gear they had purchased with their weekly pay. They spent as if the money were burning holes in their pockets. Marcus checked his banking app on his phone as he walked to his car. The balance was nearly zero. He looked at the rows of high-end items his peers flaunted and then at his own empty account. He earned exactly what they earned, yet he had nothing to show for the weeks of labor. The cycle felt locked. He started his engine, the old car rattling in the cold air, and drove home in silence. Every shift felt like a countdown to a payday that vanished before it could ever take root. He was working hard, but he was losing the race. The break room smelled of scorched coffee and stale air. Marcus sat at a plastic table, staring at a wall calendar, trying to calculate how many more shifts it would take to cover his rent. He was alone until the door groaned on its hinges. Raymond walked in, his gait heavy and deliberate. He did not go to the vending machine. Instead, he pulled out the chair opposite Marcus and leaned forward. Raymond gestured toward the window. Outside, the parking lot was a graveyard of rusted sedans and dented bumpers. "You watch them," Raymond said, his voice cutting through the hum of the overhead fans. "They spend every dollar the moment it hits their hands. They think the paycheck defines them." Raymond tapped the table with a calloused finger. "Your future is not determined by how much you make, Marcus. It is determined by how much you keep." He stood up, leaving the advice hanging in the stagnant air, and walked back toward the warehouse floor. Marcus remained seated. He looked out at the rows of aging vehicles in the lot. The logic hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been chasing the wrong metric. He had been measuring his life by the money flowing through his hands, rather than the money staying in his pocket. Marcus sat at his kitchen table that evening, the overhead light casting long shadows over a worn copy of Napoleon Hill. He flipped through the pages until a single sentence anchored his focus. "Success comes from simple disciplines practiced consistently." He closed the book. The silence of the apartment felt different now, charged with a sudden, sharp clarity. He pulled out his bank statements and his checkbook. He realized that paying the landlord, the grocery store, and the utility company first meant he was funding everyone else's future before his own. He reached for a pen and a blank envelope. He decided on a fixed percentage. Before rent, before food, before anything else, he moved that money into a separate investment account. He watched the transfer confirmation blink on his screen. It was a small amount, but it was the first time he had paid himself instead of the world. He repeated the motion, sealing the commitment in his mind. No excuses, no delays. The warehouse was no longer just a place to trade time for immediate consumption. It had become a machine for his future. He sat back, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, knowing the cycle was finally broken. The months bled into a year. Marcus continued to drive his old sedan, its engine rattling against the smooth hum of his coworkers' newer vehicles in the lot. Every Friday, the break room transformed into a planning session for the weekend. They spoke of weekend trips, expensive dining, and the latest releases. Marcus sat in the corner, nursing a lukewarm coffee, listening to the plans unfold. "You are coming with us, right?" one of them asked, gesturing toward the door. Marcus looked at his hands, then at the empty seat beside him. He thought of the investment account balance, growing by increments. And then, he looked at the group. "I cannot make it," he said. The refusal was quiet, but it felt heavy. As he walked to his sedan, he heard the roar of engines and the laughter of his friends departing for the city. He turned the key, the familiar vibration of the steering wheel vibrating through his palms. He drove home alone. The silence in the car was absolute. He parked under the dim street lamp outside his apartment, staring at the dashboard. It was a lonely path. He watched the taillights of his coworkers disappear into the distance, knowing they would spend more in a weekend than he had saved in a month. He stayed the course. The announcement came on a Tuesday, a base pay increase for every employee in the warehouse. By the end of the shift, the break room was a flurry of activity. Two of his coworkers were already comparing the heavy, metallic faces of new watches they had purchased with their first higher paychecks. They tapped the glass, admiring the weight and the brand names. "You should get one, Marcus," one said, pointing to his own wrist. "You earned the extra cash." Marcus looked at the watch, then at his own bare wrist, then back at the spreadsheet he kept in his locker. The numbers on the screen were clear. He could afford the watch, he could afford the status, but he did not look at the store windows. He pulled out his notebook and calculated the difference between his old pay and the new one. He took a pen and wrote the new, higher contribution amount for his investment account. He did not buy the watch. He did not buy the status. He went to his bank portal on his phone, keyed in the transfer, and watched the balance update. The extra money vanished into the account before it could touch his pockets. He closed the locker, feeling the weight of the choice. It was not a sacrifice of luxury, but an exchange for time. The market turned cold. News of layoffs trickled into the warehouse, carried on the hushed, frantic tones of coworkers who suddenly stopped talking about luxury gear and started watching the clock. The flickering lights overhead seemed to dim further as the economy contracted. Recession hit the headlines. One by one, the trucks and the gadgets began to disappear from the parking lot, replaced by a quiet, gnawing anxiety. A coworker leaned against a stack of crates, staring at the floor. "You are still putting money into those accounts?" he asked, his voice thin with disbelief. "The world is burning, Marcus. Keep your cash." Marcus did not look up from the scanner in his hand. He processed another box, the rhythmic beep of the machine punctuating the tension. He looked like any other man on the floor, laboring under the same fluorescent haze, his hands calloused and his brow slick with sweat. To the outside world, he was just a warehouse hand holding on. But as the market dipped and the value of his portfolio wavered, he refused to blink. He stayed the course. He treated the volatility not as a disaster, but as a test of his grip. He kept moving, kept scanning, and kept the transfers flowing, invisible to the panic that had hollowed out the room. By the time Marcus turned 30, the rhythm of his life underwent a violent change. For years, the numbers in his investment portal had crawled forward, agonizingly slow. Then, the slope of the curve shifted. It was no longer a crawl, it was a climb. The compounding effect, once a theoretical concept, became a living, breathing force. Every month, the interest earned began to dwarf his initial contributions. He watched the screen at the end of a shift, his hands still gray with warehouse dust, and saw figures that defied the logic of his hourly wage. It was an exhilarating, almost terrifying sight. The money was moving on its own now, fueled by the momentum of a decade of discipline. The foundation he had built, brick by brick, was no longer just a savings account. It was a fortress. The market swings that once felt like threats now acted as fuel for the engine. He stood in the quiet of his apartment, looking at the glowing numbers, and realized the math had finally overtaken the manual labor. The weight of the warehouse, the heavy crates, and the flickering lights suddenly felt like a distant, secondary reality. The machine he had built was awake. It was working with a force of its own, and for the first time, the trajectory was entirely out of his hands. At 35, the shift was complete. Marcus stood by the loading dock, watching the sunset bleed across the warehouse floor. He opened his digital records on a handheld device. The math was stark. That month, the dividends and market gains generated by his portfolio had surpassed the total sum of his paychecks from the warehouse. It was the crossing of a threshold he had spent 15 years chasing. He dropped his scanner onto the metal table with a clatter. For the first time in his working life, the physical toll of the shift was no longer a necessity for his existence. His capital was now generating more value than his muscles could ever produce. He looked at the crates stacked high around him, the environment that had defined his youth, and saw it with different eyes. It was no longer the source of his survival. It was merely a place he chose to be. The realization hit him with the weight of a physical blow. He walked to the edge of the loading bay, feeling the cool air against his face, and breathed in the silence. The machine was doing the heavy lifting now. The cycle of labor had been replaced by the power of his own disciplined choices. He was no longer trading time for survival. He was watching his future compound in real time. The apartment was quiet when he walked in. Marcus pulled out the wooden chair at his kitchen table and set his laptop down. The surface was cool beneath his palms. He took a slow breath, cleared his throat, and opened the lid. The screen glowed, casting a sharp light across the room. He navigated to the investment portal, his fingers lingering over the keys for a second before he hit the refresh button. The page loaded. He watched the progress bar crawl across the top of the display. When the data finally populated, he leaned forward. The total read $1,003,412. He stared at the digits. There was no sudden urge to celebrate or call out. The silence in the room felt heavy, solid, and earned. He traced the numbers on the screen with his index finger, seeing not just currency, but the thousands of individual, disciplined choices that had paved this exact moment. Every lunch he had packed, every extra shift he had taken, and every impulse he had suppressed condensed into this single, undeniable figure. He had reached the summit. He sat back, watching the cursor blink in the soft light of the kitchen, and finally let the reality of his freedom settle in. Marcus clicked the laptop shut. The sound was sharp in the quiet kitchen. He pushed the device aside and reached for his plate. The meal was simple, just as it had been every night for 15 years. He took a bite and looked out the window at the city lights. The warehouse was no longer a cage. It had been the engine of his transformation, the starting point that allowed him to build this reality from scratch. He realized that the fortune sitting in his accounts was not the goal. It was merely the byproduct of the consistency he had practiced every single day. He had traded immediate status for long-term power. He finished his dinner, set the fork down, and stood up to clear the table. There was no need to look at the numbers again. The work was done. He had proven that a lifetime of ordinary, disciplined shifts could build a future of absolute, uncompromised freedom. He walked to the sink, rinsed his plate, and turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the world moved on, but for the first time he was not reacting to its demands. He was simply living in the space he had built for himself. The cycle of sacrifice had ended. The era of his own design had begun.